Hello and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan MSP. A slight change of tack today. I'm going to talk about morality. Still, I often talk about morality, but this is in the context of the historical event of the Nagasaki and Hiroshima atom bomb events, where the US bombed entire cities with atom bombs. And also, actually, before that, Tokyo was bombed and caught fire, and a large amount of people died there. In fact, arguably, even more catastrophic, at least in the immediacy, than those atom bombs. But we will have a look at this and think about the morality involved. It's one of those events that has bypassed our moral evaluation because I think it's been embedded in our cultural baggage. We kind of all know this happened, but don't really sit down and evaluate it and say, well, it was fine because it was justified because it saved many millions of lives in the long run. And you make that assumption and you don't really question it, job done. But if any city in the world now was bombed, say in the Ukraine war taking place presently in Ukraine, if Russia bombed Kiev or Ukraine bombed Moscow in the same way to just stop the war, right? That'll stop the war. It'll stop millions of people dying going forward, but a bunch of people died now. There'll be absolute moral outrage. Like all those civilians killed uh, as an instrumental way of stopping the war, it'd be unconscionable, right? But we don't apply that kind of moral evaluation to the atom bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Why is that? So that's a question. But let's look at the morality itself to begin with, and we'll have to just rewind a little bit and just talk about moral consequentialism. So, what is moral consequentialism? Well, here's just one image off Tinternet that says consequentialism is a theory of normative ethics, so what one should do, that states that the moral value of an action or decision should be judged based on its consequences. Now, it turns out that lots of people generally quite like the idea of moral consequentialism as it has intuitive sense to them, but actually it isn't perfect. There's no moral value system that's perfect. Religious people often don't like it so much because you don't need a god for morality. It's a completely secular way of doing morality, but like every moral value system, it has its limits. In fact, there is no perfect moral value system. Hence why, after 3,000 years of moral philosophizing, no one agrees on a moral value system. Like philosophers in the Phil Papers surveys are broadly split. So there's the biggest surveys of working philosophers. They are broadly split three ways between something called deontology, consequentialism, and virtue ethics. So yes, a third of moral philosophers say this is the main one, but and there are also others as well. I would fit into the others, which is I use moral consequentialism quite often, but I know it's not perfect and it has its limits. And I'm a moral skeptic. There's no moral value system that exists out there that we are trying to discover or trying to reflect. Instead, there's nothing out there, and we construct our moral value systems here. We try and convince each other of why things are right and why things are wrong. But even if something did exist out there, we wouldn't know that we were reflecting it because we can't see what's out there. We can't access that. So there's what I call an epistemic barrier between. Well, that's like the epistemology is the study of knowledge and truth. So we have a barrier between us and anything that exists out there, such that we don't know if our moral values reflect the real moral like truths or laws that might exist out there. So I say they don't exist out there, but even if they did, they don't exist. Like it's the same as them not existing because we can't know them. So therefore, let's just forget them existing and just do our moral calculations ourselves by having these arguments. But then won't necessarily be an objective truth to morality. And a lot of people don't particularly like that, but I don't see any way around that. Okay, so a definition. Consequentialism can be broken down into two core beliefs. One, the consequences of an act are what ultimately matter when assessing its moral worth. Two, that the evaluation should focus on the overall good for society as a whole rather than on individual gains or losses. It's not necessarily true. It depends how you're going to do your moral evaluation. So I wouldn't necessarily agree with number two there. Um, So let's go and have a look at. I mean, he gives an example. A consequentialist may support harsh punishments for contravening laws because the consequence of the punishment acts as a deterrent. Some people will be punished perhaps unfairly, but in total, less people will break the law, fewer. So the harshness of the punishment is justified. That's a really problematic example as well, because uh, it sounds like it would be a good example, but in reality, we harsher punishments don't deter people more. There's a very weak correlation between harsh punishments and deterrence. So although that doesn't say the moral stance is wrong, like, you can do this if it deters people from doing that. That may be fine, but the actual data for that is hard to come by. Anyway, consequently, let's by the by. Consequentialism. There are so many different types of consequentialism. So as soon as there are problems that you come across, when you're trying to advocate for this moral value system, as soon as you come across a problem, you go, right, how do we solve this and keep moral consequentialism? So you have lots of ad hoc arrangements and add-ons and this and that. So utilitarianism is that actions should maximize pleasure, the most pleasure for the most people. Rule utilitarianism, follow rules that generally lead to the maximization of pleasure. So you might have a rule that sometimes doesn't work, like never lie. You say, well, actually, I should lie in this situation because it brings out about a moral gain, and I can work that out in this instance. So you have the inquiring murderer. I'm a child murderer. Do you know where Jack and Jill are? And you know that Jack and Jill are up in your loft. So you say, no, I don't know where they are because you're going to murder them. So that's a good lie, right? But the rule of thumb is that you shouldn't lie because generally it's a bad thing to do. So rather than having to evaluate each thing, each action on the potential predicted outcomes, you just say, right, it's bad to lie. And you try and live by that rule. Two-level utilitarianism, attempt to follow utilitarianism generally, but where unable to due to a time constraint, follow rule utilitarianism. So state consequentialism, actions should benefit the state. Ethical egoism, actions should maximize personal benefit, i.e. the effect on others is irrelevant. So this is where, that definition 2 would be incorrect there for that kind of consequentialism. And ethical altruism, action should maximize the benefits of others or to others. The effect on you is irrelevant. So, and there are many more as well. It's just a soupçon of the different types that you might come across. Jack Bauer in 24 TV series that's quite an interesting choice, because actually consequentialism as a moral ethic is investigated a heap in that. He ends up doing bad things to people to get a good result quite often, whether that be sort of torture or whether it be killing someone for, so on and so forth. So that series does a lot of delving into morality. So the classic thought experiment to look at this kind of morality is the trolley experiment, where you are standing to the side of two tracks. One track has one person working on it, the other has 5 people working on it. Here they're tied up, but imagine they're just working. And you see a trolley is just about to go down the track that has 5 on, and you have a choice. Do you pull the lever so that it takes a detour and takes out the one person, but and therefore the 5 survive, or do you let it carry on to kill the 5? And it turns out that when people have done sort of experiments about what people believe here, I think about 89% of people would actually pull the lever. So you intuitively, yeah, it seems sensible to pull the lever to kill the one person to save the 5. But in this situation, what you're doing is you are actually killing that one person. So by pulling the lever, you're actually effectively murdering that one person in a sense. Or you're making a choice that one person should die so that the 5 survive. It's a better calculation. It could be 3 and 5. You make that calculation. Yeah, I'm going to kill 3 so that 5 survive, so on and so forth. And it can get very different. Would you do it if it's your son or daughter or mother or father on the line, so on and so forth? And then there's very sort of many different ways you can look at this, and the impact of psychology on this is obviously pretty important. In fact, that's what I'll go to next. So the next version of this is, do you push, and it's often said as, do you push a fat man? The idea here is that the person is large enough to stop the trolley from going any further, right? And the reason why that's important is because the implication is you as a thinker involved in this thought experiment are not as large as this person. And if you jumped off yourself to try and, you know, sacrifice yourself to save the five, some people say, oh, I'd like to do that instead. Actually, you're not large enough, so the supposition is, to stop the trolley. So that's why there's a large person there. So you push the large person off, they fall onto the track, stop the trolley, but they die. It's exactly the same thought experiment in terms of the calculation there. You are pulling a lever or you're pushing someone off a bridge, but you are, that one person is dying so that five survive. Now the interesting data here is that percentage of 89% people would pull the lever. It's reversed when it comes to actually pushing someone. In other words, we can more easily pull a lever than we can push someone or pull a trigger and shoot someone in front of us. In other words, and this kind of explains how maybe pilots on the Enola Gay who dropped the one of the atom bombs, they were able to do that because it is about pulling a lever, pushing a button, rather than actually imagine having to take a gun or trying to strangle like 100,000 people. Would you be able to do that? No. Okay, but can you press a button to drop an atom bomb that would do that, to, you know, stop the war or whatever? Yes, I can do that. So that is really important to bear in mind, that it's easy to say, yeah, it's fine, and we can sit off to the side and say it's fine to drop an atom bomb. You know, yeah, it's horrible, but it's for a greater good type thing. It's a means to an end. But actually, you know, again, would you be able to kill those people individually yourself? Would you? What about if your parents, if your family were in the 100,000 people? Would that change the calculation? So there's all these things to consider, rather than just having this blithe assumption that, yeah, dropping the atom bomb's fine. Um, Okay, so let's go on and have a look at the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So this is from the Encyclopedia Britannica. A number of factors contributed to the United States' decision to drop atomic bombs on Japan. One reason was Japan's unwillingness to surrender unconditionally. Japan wanted to keep their emperor and conduct their own war trials and did not want to be occupied by US forces. However, the US wanted unconditional surrender, which thus meant the continuation of the war. Japan refused to surrender after multiple firebombing campaigns, such as the bombing of Tokyo, which arguably killed as many as 100,000 people. On March 9th to 10th, 1945, the bombing of Tokyo alone claimed tens of thousands of lives and is often cited as one of the most destructive acts of war in history. Although the precise death toll is unknown, conservative estimates suggest that the firestorm caused by incendiary bombs killed at least 80,000 people, likely more than 100,000, in a single night. Some 1 million people were left homeless. It looked increasingly likely that the United States would have to commit itself to a land invasion, which could have claimed many American lives. So it might not be so much about saving lives in general, but about saving American lives. It would have saved 5 million lives across the war. I think America was probably far more worried about how many American lives would this save. So there's a kind of limit to their morality. They're not concerned about Japanese lives. They're concerned about American lives. That's not a criticism, but it's kind of like, is this a universal morality where it's better for everyone? No, this is about, is it better for the US? And I think that might be worthy of note. So instead, the atomic bomb served as a tool to bring the war in the Pacific to a close sooner. Another reason why the US dropped the atomic bombs, and specifically the second one on Nagasaki, has to do with the Soviet Union. So again, it's getting a little bit more nuanced now. So these people, so if we go back to the moral calculation here, the idea is that this person, this single worker on the line, is being used as a means to an end. Some people in morality, like Immanuel Kant, would say you can't use people as a means to an end. You can't use them instrumentally. This person is being an instrument and you are using them as a means to your end. And your end, you might be beneficial overall in other ways of looking at it, but you shouldn't use people as a means to an end. And that's what certain moralists will say, certain moral philosophers would say. And of course, this, if you're now looking at these bombs being used, particularly the Nagasaki one, as not about so much stopping the war, but sending a message to the Soviet Union for other reasons, then you really are using the death of these 80,000, 100,000 people as a way of sending a signal to the Soviet Union, as a political message, then it becomes somewhat more controversial, arguably. So on the August the 8th, 1945, 2 days after the Hiroshima bombing, as agreed by Joseph Stalin during the Tehran and Yalta conferences in 1943 and 1945 respectively, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. It is possible that US President Harry Truman ordered the atomic bomb to be dropped on Nagasaki not only to further force Japan to surrender, but also to keep the Soviets out of Japan by displaying American military power, distrust, and a sense of rivalry had been built up between the two superpowers that ultimately culminated in the Cold War. Then, so if we're going to go back here, the atom bombs, let's assume that they are a very clear cut example of the trolley experiment. That the US decided to drop two bombs and indeed bombed Tokyo. So these are civilian cities, right? Yeah, there might have been some military targets in them, but that wasn't really the concern. So let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that you've got the death of some 300,000 civilians, like arguably innocent people, and you are using them to stop predominantly American lives being lost. It might not even been as many as 300,000 American lives. So you often hear the talk of they did this to stop millions of lives as a whole. Like 5 million people didn't die as a result of this war, right? Being stopped by the bombs. 300,000 civilians stop X million people dying in general. But I think that's actually slightly incorrect. I don't think that's what the Americans were thinking about. I think it's only in terms of American lives. So it's 300,000 Japanese civilians on this track here, if you like, and then an amount of American soldiers. I don't know how many they calculated, but it might be fewer than 300,000. It might be more than 300,000, right? That would be the calculation. But you can see it's an instrumental calculation. They're using those 300,000 civilians as instruments, and that's men, women, children, old people, fetuses, all sorts, everything. So if you're really pro-life, then it's an interesting idea. It's like, is it still acceptable? Can you kill people? Can you kill one person to save five? Is that something you're happy with? Okay. What if those those people that you're killing, that person you're killing is a child? So what, that one person there's a child, really innocent child. Okay. And these five people are old people. Does that make any difference? What if these, so you have all these different ways of totting this calculation up. But at the end of the day, you've got 300,000 Japanese people of all kind of types of working class, elite, women, men, children, old people, disabled, hospitalized, fully healthy, really educated, not educated at all. Every 300,000 people are wiped out. Okay. Is that acceptable? And I talked about this a little bit with regard to some of the activities that have taken place in Ukraine, and talk about the use of nuclear bombs themselves in Ukraine, also the destruction of the Novikhovka Dam, all these kind of ideas where you've got people dying and horrors happening for a greater good. And you can talk about it in terms of war crimes, right? Dressing up in the opposition's uniform, the enemy uniform. Well, that's a war crime. That's called perfidy. You're not allowed to do that. But what if it brings a greater good? I talked about this with regard to the Russian volunteer corps in the north of Ukraine, who are some of the leaders are really far right, sort of neo Nazis, but they're doing kind of a good thing to make an incursion into Russian territory to help the Ukrainian war effort. So do we kind of say, right, these are bad people, but they're doing a good thing, so we'll forget their kind of moral badness in this area because they're doing a greater good? So again, it's like for the greater good. A greater good comes about, and we can allow a small amount of evil. Goes back to one person versus five. We can allow a smaller evil, one person dying, to allow a greater good, five people surviving. So there is that, and I did some videos on this, and then you have these kind of reactions. You're a fool trying to set today's standards to World War II. The reason I'm reading this because actually they bring up points that are worthy of note. So the idea that morality has changed from World War II to now is just simply not right. I mean, we've had the same moral arguments for 3,000 years and don't disagree, and still don't agree on them. So that we're judging human beings from 80 years ago on today's standards is not right. I mean, this argument, what I'm saying today, applied exactly at that time as well. There's absolutely no difference. So the effects of the bomb were mostly unknown and theorized at the time. Results were unexpectedly good. An invasion of mainland Japan would have put casualties in the millions. Plus, we won't mention the Banzai charges and kamikazes. Tokyo firebombing induced more casualties than Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Please stick to the damn war and stop the bad analogies and comparisons. You do good work. You're saying stick to your commentary on the war. You do good stuff there. Don't talk about moral philosophy. I'm like, actually, that's my wheelhouse. That's really what I should be talking about. But all of these points are exactly like, yes, I agree with kind of, well, apart from that very first point, yeah, okay, let's assume this stopped millions of people dying. The question is this still the right thing to do? And the point is that if that happened today, and this is maybe where he's thinking about today's standards, but this would have been the same, I'm sure, to many people at the time. It's just I wasn't alive at the time. People I know weren't really alive at the time, and I don't know what the actual reaction would have been to this. There would have been a lot of cognitive dissonance reduction. People going, that's horrible, but maybe it's good, and that's by the good guy. American and British people be thinking we're the good guys. We've kind of done that. Okay, so it must be good, and there'll be all sorts of stuff going on in people's minds. But really, was it good? Like today, if we dropped a bomb on Moscow and it stopped the Ukraine war, and even if it did stop more people from dying in the long run, you make that's like a prediction that you've got to be sure of that to do something as horrific as dropping an atom bomb on a city. But let's assume that that does happen. Would that still be right? Would it be all right for me to sanction killing 100,000 civilians to do that? And then you get all sorts of weird and wonderful justifications, which is that I here, if you look at this one, I just think it's absolutely horrific. Do you think the civilians of Japan were innocent? Read how they murdered POWs. Yes, civilians did this, and civilian medical staff performed painful and inhumane experiments on POWs. Sometimes there is a blurring of the line between civilian and military. Not all cultures are equivalent. I think that's incredibly dubious. Yes, there may have been some civilians that did horrible things to POWs in some way, but to assume that 300,000, this is how you justify, like, I don't know, there's some biblical atrocities like the 10 plagues and the death of all the firstborn. All Egyptians were just evil, it's fine to kill all the firstborn. Or the flood, all humans were evil, including the fetuses and unborn. Yeah, evil. It's like, here, 300,000 Japanese are all terrible with one brush, as if they all I mean, that's a way of if you really want to justify dropping that bomb or those bombs and doing that firebombing on Tokyo, if you're really intent on that being a good thing to do, then one way to do it is by painting every single one of those as evil people. But the reality is that will not be the case. And so, yeah, it's just, as this person says here, it is muddy. America wanted to prevent the Soviets from occupying any part of Japan. America wanted to demonstrate their power, their new power, to intimidate the Soviets. So again, it's not just about saving lives by taking lives. It's also by sending a message that advances your political agenda as well. And so it's a really difficult one, this, because on the one hand, like, I quite often use moral consequentialism to justify activity, but on the other hand, it has its limits, as I say. And here's one example, quite famous example. It's a hospital example. And so this chap here who says, you're a fool, it's justified, and this guy saying all Japanese are, well, let's more concentrate on this chap here. So he says, yeah, it's justified. So that's to say that in order to save more people in the long run, it's justified in taking the lives of other people without their permission up front. Okay, so by that logic, this chap should allow himself to be. He walks into the hospital for a routine appointment. He's ostensibly healthy. This Warren chap. He walks in. I'm a healthy guy, yeah. And the doctor takes him and says, "Oh, you're healthy, yeah. We're just going to kill you, and we're going to harvest your organs, 5 different organs, and we're going to give them to 5 people who are then able to survive as a result of us taking your organs. So that's fine, right?" And of course, this Warren chap is going to be like, "No, you can't use me. What about my What about my desires and intentions here? What about my rights here? You can't use me to make 5 other people survive. Yes, it might be good for you as a lever puller, but what about me as a person? So this Warren chap is looking from this point of view, but failing to imagine himself as this person. In other words, if he is justifying the 300,000 people dying here, he is also, by extension, justifying himself being murdered in a hospital and his organs being given to 5 people. And he's justifying that calculation to be made at all times. In other words, we should be making all the time moral consequentialist ethical judgments and evaluations to navigate our way through daily lives, and that becomes really problematic because you end up doing stuff like that. Well, yeah, more people will survive if we do that, but just murdering people that walk into the hospital against their will is pretty nuts, right? So, and that is, I think that's a really good moral parallel there. And if he disagrees that people like it, that he should not be, I mean, it becomes very self-serving. It's like it's fine if 300,000 Japanese people die, but if I die for 5 people to survive, no, that ain't happening. Okay, well, let's look at the logic there because there's 300,000 people over there that are going to be saying pretty much the same thing as you there. And if you're justified in denying that, then they're justified in denying this from happening as well. So how does that work? It might depend on from which kind of level you're looking at this. So you extricate yourself from being in any particular civilization or any particular community in the world and say, right, I'm interested in the world flourishing to the best of its abilities, then almost like a kind of god figure. If you're looking down on the world, you say, yeah, that's fine. Then that the world will flourish more if 300,000 Japanese people died rather than the war continued. So I will justify that. But then, and if you're looking at this from an American, you'll have a different evaluation from looking at this as a Japanese person. But then, even as the kind of god figure, would I like to be in that position? No. Well, then, am I having double standards? If I'm not willing to be in that position myself, it's okay if it happens to someone else. Well, what if my parents were in Hiroshima? What if my family, extended family? What if? And you can think of all these situations where it changes your moral calculation depending on who those people are. And that shows that actually we aren't always rational when we are doing our moral evaluations. We're quite often psychological. It's like, yeah, just in general, that calculation is okay, but certain times I feel really uncomfortable doing that. If I have to kill them individually, or if it's my parents, or so on and so forth. So my point of doing this video is to I don't even know where my moral evaluation lies here. Uh, it's just a really complicated one, and that was kind of what my original points were when I was making the videos before. That some people reacted really badly to, but my all I'm trying to do is say, hey, these things are nuanced, right? They are is very muddy, and also when you're making these kind of calculations, that if we drop these bombs, they will surrender and stop. And actually, there is no guarantee. You don't know how many people would have died in some kind of alternate future. Like you're assuming, oh, this will stop 200,000 Americans died, but something could have happened. The Japanese could have done something themselves to stop the war. The war could have stopped in another way or whatever. So you are kind of trying to work with the best information you have at the time, but you're making some pretty bold predictions that may or may not be justifiable. So that's always a bit of an issue as well. So I mean, I myself, as I was saying, I'm really not sure what I believe about this because I'm pretty damn certain that if that happened now today, where an atom bomb was dropped on 1, 2, 3 civilian cities full of civilians, firebombing an entire city or whatever, I would be absolutely morally outraged. And if I'd be morally outraged today, then I should probably be morally outraged with this happening. With people in such huge numbers, and it's interesting whether the number makes a big difference, you know. But with people in such huge numbers being used instrumentally against their intentions, I wouldn't like to be killed in a hospital walking in. So how can I justify allowing that same kind of calculation to take place for 300,000 civilians? But I don't know. Let me what you think. Yeah, let me know what you think. I'm very interested to get feedback on this about your ideas as to whether this was truly justifiable, and think about from what point in history you're trying to justify it, from what point of view you're trying to justify it, from an American, Allied, Soviet, Japanese, whatever, from the people who died, knowing people who were there. Would your evaluations change if X or Y, as I've talked about already? Have a little think about how you feel about this, and let me know in the comments below. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. That's just a little delve into this without really providing any answers. That's philosophy, eh? Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.